Welcome back to World History. Today we're going to talk about the way that Martin Luther's ideas took hold and spread around Europe and then around the world. Martin Luther's movement eventually became known as the Reformation because it changed and reformed the Catholic Church, and the followers of Luther became known as Protestants because they were protesting what they saw as unjust Catholic practices. But the problem with Luther's belief that everyone has the right to interpret the Bible for themselves means that people are going to have different interpretations. And so whereas Roman Catholicism continues on mostly the same, the Protestant movement is going to quickly fracture into a variety of different sects because, of course, they're going to interpret the Bible differently. And so we're going to explore how this looks in a variety of different places today. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the effect of the spread of Protestant ideas, compare the teachings of a guy named John Calvin to the originator of Protestantism, Martin Luther, and analyze why the Church of England was created and how England dealt with the religious conflict of changing religions. So that brings us to John Calvin and his Utopia in Geneva. John Calvin was a Protestant reformer who took some of the teachings of Luther and changed them to some degree. The big piece of Calvin's teaching that you need to know is this idea of predestination. Predestination is the idea that at the beginning of time, God chose a group of people who were going to be saved and then everyone else is going to hell. And so Calvin determined that you needed to figure out if you were a member of this elect, this group of people that was to be saved. And then, of course, that would mean that you're definitely going to heaven. So how do you know if you're a member of the elect? Well, according to Calvinist teachings, a member of the elect acts in a certain way. And so when John Calvin created his Calvinist government in Geneva, he imposed strict rules on people, all of these things, and basically said that if you follow these rules, it means you're a member of the elect. But if you don't follow these rules, you're probably not a member of the elect, and we're going to kick you out of the society. And so it created, theoretically, a perfect religious utopia, assuming you like to not do anything that's fun. Calvin's ideas eventually took hold and spread to a variety of different places, including up to England and then through other parts of France. And the Pilgrims and Puritans that came to the United States in the early 1600s were Calvinists and believed in this idea as well. But not all these Protestant groups had the same level of success. For example, a group called the Anabaptists believed that the Catholic Church was so corrupt that in order to become repurified, as an adult, you needed to be baptized again. This second baptism would then clear out all your sins and pave the way for your journey into heaven. The Anabaptists took over the city of Münster in what is today Germany, the same way that the Calvinists took over Geneva, and they tried to create a perfect Anabaptist society the same way that Calvin tried to create his perfect one in Geneva. Unfortunately for the Anabaptists, it went south for them pretty quickly because they decided that Jesus was going to come back like tomorrow or really soon anyway. And so they started forcibly baptizing people and then killing people who wouldn't get baptized. This led the local lords around them to sort of freak out about these murderous millennial cultists, as they saw them. And they surrounded the city and crushed the Anabaptist movement. And so whereas Calvinism became an established part of the Protestant movement, the Anabaptists were for the most part crushed and did not have the same levels of success. But the place that probably benefited the most from this whole Protestantism thing was also the place that in some ways changed the least, England. So, what's the story of Protestantism in England? Well, it starts with this gentleman. This is King Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII, of course, like all kings, wanted to make sure that he had a son that he could pass on the crown to prevent some sort of bloody succession crisis / civil war. He was married to this nice lady. This is Catherine of Aragon. She is a Spanish princess. And unfortunately, they did not have a son. They kept having daughters, and so Henry decided that this was his wife's fault, and he wanted to divorce his wife and marry his mistress, a lady named Anne Boleyn, who he was just sure would give him a son. So, of course, because marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church, he needed to write to the Pope to get a special dispensation. Here's your Pope here. To get a special dispensation to get a divorce, which the Pope was not inclined to give him. And so Henry decided, if the Pope won't give me a divorce, and there are rulers all over Europe who are breaking with the Catholic Church, this seems like an easy solution. And so Henry broke with the Catholic Church and created a new church that would eventually be called the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is more or less exactly the same as the Catholic Church, except instead of the Pope being the head of the church, Henry's the head of the church. And so now, if he wants a divorce, rather than having to write to the Pope for a divorce, he can just ask himself for a divorce. This is often called the middle path, because although technically the Anglican Church is a Protestant church, it kept most of the facets of the Catholic Church. The massive cathedrals, the bishops, and all of this stuff, a lot of the rituals were the same, but for Henry, he's now the head of the church. And the Act of Supremacy in England meant that everyone had to swear to him as head of the church. Unfortunately, some people did not do so. This is Sir Thomas More. You may remember him as the writer of the book Utopia. He refused to swear to Henry VIII and was beheaded for his crimes. Unfortunately for Henry, the problems did not stop with his ability to give himself a new wife, because Anne Boleyn was not able to give him a son, and so she was executed, also maybe for adultery. Then he married Jane Seymour, who was also not able to give him a son. Then married Anne of Cleves, who he didn't like because he didn't think she was pretty enough. Then married Catherine Howard, who he also killed. And finally married Catherine Parr. So these are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. You can go and find a variety of videos or do reading about it if you're interested. Despite all of this effort and these many wives and the beheadings, the whole thing didn't work out for Henry because although he did have a son, Edward died very young, and the crown was passed to Mary, who was his daughter with his first Catholic wife, Catherine. Mary tried to roll back the clock on this whole thing, persecuting and just burning Protestants at the stake. And so her rule was unpleasant enough that she got the moniker Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. But after her reign, she also did not have a son or a key heir to pass off the throne to. The throne fell to her sister, Elizabeth I, who is one of the most famous queens in English history. I wish we had time to go into all the stuff about Elizabeth, about the way in which she set up systems to help the poor, or her defeat of the Spanish Armada, or her financing of pirates, or all of this cool stuff. But all that you need to know about Elizabeth I is she embraced this idea of religious compromise. So she reformed the church in order to allow it to be both acceptable to Protestants and Catholics. And so everyone realized, well, okay, I guess we can sort of worship how we choose, kind of. And so with England taking a middle path of compromise, this is the legacy of the Reformation. In general, it encouraged more people to be able to read. It strengthened some countries while weakening others. Most importantly, it brought back some of the Greek and Roman ideals of individualism, the idea that individual humans can figure out things about the world and can make decisions for themselves about both religious matters and things that aren't necessarily religious, which is going to kick us into our next topic, the growth of science and technology. But for today, hopefully you're able to give reasonable answers to these questions in the provided document, and when we come back, we'll continue our story.